This is the Unit 3 overview lecture video. We're going to start off with Chapter 8, and again, we're following the same pattern. We start off with the biosocial. The first couple of questions, we have a couple questions about nutrition, picky eating, things like that. So one of the questions says, should children be allowed to eat only when they want? So I just want to stress the word when that we're talking about here. It does not say only what they want. So obviously, we can't let children just eat whatever they want because they definitely would probably pick the unhealthy foods. They're going to want what tastes good and not maybe what is healthy for them. But when we're talking about when they want to eat, there's a section in the textbook that talks about nutrition and overfeeding children at this age. So in age 2 to 6, the need for calories really slows down. So when they're infants, they're just eating constantly, they're growing constantly, they need a whole lot more calories per pound. And then as they start to get a little taller, they get into that kind of past the toddler phase where they're starting to get thinner out, and they just aren't really growing quite as much as they were when they were an infant. And so the need for calories is less. Plus, you take into consideration that in our society, at least, they aren't really burning as many calories as children in the past have. So we don't see kids playing outside as much. Recess time has been cut really short. They spend a lot more time indoors, watching TV, playing video games, things like that, or even at school. And so we're not seeing as much physical activity. So say like in a farming type of culture, the kids would be out there working, or they're running around playing, or, things like that. So we've kind of seen in our society this epidemic happening of childhood obesity. And parents usually have these good intentions because they think my child's not eating, and they're scared that something's wrong, or they're not going to eat enough, they're going to starve basically. So when food is scarce, we have this tendency that we need to make sure our kids are eating. We want to make sure that they're being fed, which is a good tendency. But when you combine that with they need fewer calories and they're not burning as many calories, then we start to run into this problem of childhood obesity. So basically, the idea behind this question is kind of not forcing kids to eat when they're not hungry. So of course, we want to have family meal times. We want to offer healthy foods when we are eating. There's definitely needs to be a balance in that. We just, we can't let the kids just take care of their own schedule and eat whenever they want. That's not really what we're talking about here. So when answering this question, just keep that in mind, that nutrition section, and just talking about not forcing a child to eat when they're not hungry, because sometimes they really won't be hungry, and that's okay. And this idea of you have to clean your plate, and if you eat 2 more bites, then you can have dessert, and we're kind of, some parents have this tendency to just force feed children, and it's really not necessary, and it really does cause health problems down the road. Then the next topic we're going to hit on is this. There's some questions about having things just right, or being picky about a routine, or having things a certain way. And so this version of the textbook doesn't really do a great job of explaining this, so I think this question might kind of trip some people up. A lot of this is about preservation, which we're going to learn about here in a little bit. Same chapter 8, we learn about preservation and impulsiveness. But basically, kids really like this feeling of predictability, of routine. They like to have some sort of control over their environment and kind of know what's going to be happening. And not all kids, but for the most part. And this is sort of just a general. It's not to say that you have to do everything at the exact same time, or, that it has to be so rigid that there's no time for a fun change or a surprise or something like that. But for the most part, kids like to have a little bit of control over their schedule. They like to know where they're going or what they're doing, and to understand what's coming next. So these questions about being picky or wanting things just right come from this need for some stability, some routine in their life. It helps them to be a little more calm and being able to move from one thing to another. So say if you just kids playing, they're super interested in building a tower with blocks or whatever, and you just all of a sudden walk up and say, okay, time to go, and you grab the blocks, you put them away, we're leaving. The child doesn't have a whole lot of time to transition, like they're still sort of stuck in this idea of, well, wait, I was working on this and now all of a sudden it gets switched. So there'll be, questions about like wearing the same shirt all the time or having the same color toothbrush or something like that. And that's this idea of preservation, which I'm going to explain here in just a minute. On the brain development during this age group, this 2 to 6, we're working a lot on myelination, and that has to do with processing speed. So you'll notice that young children in this age are slower to do things. They kind of take their time at picking out a toy or, deciding what they're going to wear. They're not in a big hurry to do much, and that is because of myelination and their processing speed. It just takes them a little bit longer to get onto an idea. So myelination is the white matter in the brain helps the neurons to be able to fire back and forth, and that's how that thought process speeds up. So when there's more white matter, it goes faster. And so kids are working on getting myelinated during this time. So that's why we see an increase in processing speed during this time. The corpus callosum is the part in the middle that connects the two sides of the brain. So a lot of development is happening there as well. So that's helping with coordination and things that are needing both sides of the brain. And then impulsiveness and preservation. This is what I was mentioning before. So impulsiveness is the idea that they kind of just jump into an activity without really thinking about it. And preservation would be the opposite of they kind of get stuck in an idea and they have a hard time getting out of it. So they kind of go between these two opposites, which can be frustrating for parents because, one minute they're jumping into a swimming pool fully clothed because they're impulsive. They see a pool and they think, oh, I want to go swimming. So they just jump in because they don't have that thought process of, okay, well, I need to change clothes. I need to make sure mom is there. I need to, do this pattern of what would make logical sense to an adult. They don't have that quite yet. So they might run out into the middle of the street, and it's because of this impulsiveness. And then with the preservation, it's like I mentioned before, how they kind of get stuck in a routine. They get stuck on an idea. They'll I have to watch this one certain show or I have to wear this one certain outfit. And it's this idea that they kind of get stuck in an emotion or an idea. And this a lot of times too is where tantrums come from because they're stuck in this feeling of being upset about something and their brain just cannot switch it off. So switching back and forth, it's like these impulses are either on or they're off and they have a harder time with switching back and forth. And that's due to the immaturity in their frontal lobe. And during these years, they're working on it. Sometimes they're just not quite there yet. And then there are 3 parts of the brain that are really developing a lot during this stage. The amygdala is in charge of emotion. The hippocampus is in charge of memory. And then the hypothalamus is in charge of hormones. So I want to talk about the amygdala for a second. There are some questions about fear and childhood fears and how should you respond to them. The amygdala is where fear comes from. That's the part of the brain that processes fear. And it's really developing a lot from age 2 to 6. So that is the reason why fears are more common during this age, is because the amygdala is just starting to go crazy with all of these emotions, and fear is a big, strong part of that. But they don't quite have the logical part of their brain developed yet. So they have a hard time being able to control that and process that. So again, they're working on it, but that's why sometimes kids have these irrational fears. So for how parents should handle it, we want to talk about validation because it's really important for the child to know that they are understood, that you hear what they're saying, that you're not just going to ignore them. So even if their fears don't make sense to you as an adult and it seems crazy, it is important to try to understand where they're coming from and what they are afraid of. Because the amygdala responds to comfort and not logic because it's this emotion center. So the logical part of it does not make sense to the amygdala. So if we say they're afraid of a monster under the bed and we go in and say, oh, that's crazy. There's no such thing as monsters. That's probably not going to work because the amygdala just needs comfort. So instead, we give them a big hug. We validate, oh, I'm sorry you're scared. I know that's, that's a scary thought or, something like that, to where we're understanding where they're coming from. The last part of that then would be social referencing. And that is how we decide to respond, helps them to know how they should act. So if we don't make a big deal about it, we just comfort, we, validate what they're feeling, but then we move on to something else. Kids kind of can catch on to your anxiety and things like that. So definitely taking care of it in a calm and quick manner, and then moving on to something else should help. Okay, so when we talk about motor skill development, gross motor skills are the bigger muscles, things like running or catching a ball or jumping or something like that. And then fine motor skills are the smaller things, like more of the finger motions, like buttoning a button or writing with a pencil or something like that. So gross always comes before fine. And that is because the fine motor skills take a lot more coordination between the two sides of the brain, which we talked about before. The corpus callosum is still developing during this time, so they don't always have that coordination from right to left side of the brain. So that's why fine motor skills just take a little bit longer, a little more patience. And then the last part is injuries and child abuse. So just make sure you know the difference between the primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention when we're talking about injuries. An example to give you that kind of helps make sense of these three different types would be a playground. So primary prevention would be making sure that the playground is safe. So the equipment is well maintained. There's a soft surface underneath. It's not going to be on top of some concrete or something like that. So just the environment itself. Then the secondary would be, okay, when my kid is crossing the monkey bars, I'm going to make sure I'm standing underneath them or nearby so that if they start to slip, I can catch them, because that's kind of a more dangerous activity that would need a little more supervision. And then tertiary would be when an accident happens, the medical care that you would be able to get them to the doctor quickly or, put ice on it or something like that. So those are the three different types of prevention. And then when we talk about child abuse, it's important for us to understand what the signs are, the warning signs, and there's a whole chart in your textbook that goes through those. But basically, the idea that I want to really stress here on this part of the lecture is the reporting. It's really important that if there's any suspicion, we've got to report it. You don't have to have solid proof. It doesn't hurt to make a phone call. Then the people that are trained to look into it can look into it just to be safe. You hear these stories that somebody gets their child taken away for no reason and, CPS made the wrong decision. And yes, that does happen. Unfortunately, they're not perfect, but it's better to err on the side of caution when it comes to things like this. And some professions that you might be going into you would be a mandated reporter. So if you're a teacher or, in social work or something like that, caretaker, a child care center, you're going to be a mandated reporter in a lot of cases. So in that instance, you're legally bound that you have to report any suspicion of child abuse. It's just better to be safe than sorry when it comes to that. Okay, then we'll move on to chapter 9, and that is the cognitive development. So we're going to come back to Piaget. And a lot of the things that are happening during this stage, we're in the pre-operational stage from age 2 to 6. Language development is a big part of that. These little guys are really fun because it's all about the imagination, and there's really not a whole lot of logic to them just yet. Another thing about 2 to 6 is that they're very egocentric. So I just want to explain, egocentric does not mean selfish. It just means that they can only see their own perspective on something. So let me give you an example of how that's not selfish. So say you're picking out a birthday present for grandma, and you're with 3-year-old, little Johnny, and little 3-year-old Johnny is like really into trains. So you go to the store and you say, what should we get for grandma? And Johnny's going to say, we should get her a train. So of course that he's not being selfish. He wants to give the gift to his grandma, but he just can only imagine that she would like something that he would like because he cannot take someone else's perspective. Another feature of this age is irreversibility. So this is the idea that once something is done, it cannot be undone. So I think there's a question about making a sandwich the wrong way or something like that. That's where the irreversibility comes in, because they think once something has happened, then they can't go back. Even if you take it off and, try to fix it, it's ruined at that point. Which, when we talked about that having to have things just right, it's kind of the same idea. They just can't get over whatever had happened before it's done, and it can't be undone. And then the last part is the focus on appearance. So you'll see these experiments where they're having water in 2 different size containers, and you can tell from the first part that they're exactly the same, and then they pour it into like a taller container and then they think there's more. It's just because they see it and it looks bigger. So they don't have this concept of conservation just yet. Vygotsky is still a big part of this age group with guided participation and all of the social learning, things like that, in preschool and in elementary school. This is a big part of what they do with the zone of proximal development. It's kind of figuring out where the child is at and then pushing them just a little bit beyond that with some help from some scaffolding from a teacher or a mentor or somebody that knows how to do it. So they're going to kind of help guide them. You'll see a cute video about the theory of mind. So this is sort of like the egocentrism that we just talked about. They can't take someone else's perspective. So there's an experiment with a crayon box that's filled with M&Ms, and they think that as soon as they see that there's M&Ms in there, then everyone must think there's M&Ms because that's what they see from their perspective. So they just cannot take someone else's perspective and realize that someone else doesn't have the same information that they have. In the language development, they are really taking off during these years. There's the vocabulary explosion, and they're having some shortcuts, things like fast mapping, and that's why sometimes they can have some funny words that they say. It's because it's actually a sign that their language development is on track, because they can use these rules that they've learned and then they just apply them to a new word, which it might not quite fit the new word. And there's some cute examples about that, of why kids will say like foots instead of feet. It's because they have learned that, you add the S to make something plural, so they just apply that to everything then. So that's part of the language development, and it's actually a good sign when you hear them say things like that. And then the last part of this chapter is just the differences in all these different types of early childhood education. So just kind of look through these different ones and make sure you know the difference of how they each work and what the ideas are behind them. And then finally, we'll move on to chapter 10, which is the psychosocial, going back to kind of the Erikson idea. And there are a couple different types of play that we want to talk about: sociodramatic and rough and tumble. And sociodramatic would be like pretending and acting out some scene or something like that. And then rough and tumble would be things like little wrestling or even playing tag or, things like that, kind of more physical. So both of these types of play are beneficial for both boys and girls. So I think sometimes parents, will say that boys can only do rough and tumble and girls can only do sociodramatic, which really is not the case. There's lots of benefits for both types, for boys and for girls. So definitely you want to talk about the benefits of both of these types of play. That doesn't mean that a boy has to be dressing up as a princess. They can act out the things that they are interested in. It's just this idea of using your imagination and pretending. There's a question about the displacement hypothesis, and I don't think that exact term is included in this newer version of the textbook. So I'm going to explain what it is, but basically there's an article about too much media making our kids sick, and that's what you want to use when you're answering those questions about too much media displacement hypothesis. So basically the displacement hypothesis is that when you're using media, it is taking the place of something else you could be doing. And that's true for adults as well as children. So that's where the displacement comes from, is that the media is sort of taking up our time that we could be spending doing something else. So just the fact that your child is watching an educational TV show, okay, well that's okay, but it is still displacing something else that they could be doing that might be more beneficial. So the idea behind this article and this whole hypothesis is not that media is horrible, that your children should never watch any TV or play any video games at all, but it's just that we really need to be careful about limiting the amount of time, because kids are going to want to, spend a lot of time on media, and too much media can be very harmful to children in lots of different ways. So we, as caretakers and parents, just have to be careful about balancing that time and making sure that they're spending enough time playing outside and reading and talking to people and, all of the different things that are important to their development. Because if we displace all of those things with just media, they're not going to be developing in all those other areas. Okay, something that I want to spend a little more time on is parenting styles. And this is a really important aspect of child development. It's something that you can really apply in your own life and in your own family. Even if you're not a parent right now, or you already have been a parent and your kids are grown, these parenting styles are really important to recognize and understand in your own families. And then even just if you have a job that works with helping children or parents or anything like that, these are really important to understand. Okay, so the first type that we're going to talk about is authoritarian. So basically with these styles, there's this sliding scale of warmth and of discipline. So you can kind of visualize there would be, a 4-quadrant graph or something that has warmth on one side and discipline on the other. So authoritarian is low on the warmth and high on the discipline. So these would be parents that are really, really strict. They're very, very structured. To the point where there's just not even any consideration for, listening to what the child has to say or making an exception for something. It's my way or the highway. These types of parents will use a lot of punishment. Their kids might always be grounded or always getting a spanking or, and there's just not a lot of the explaining why that's happening or conversation back and forth. And they're lower on the warmth. And these are things like positive conversations and physical hugging and compliments and just that kind of more relationship level of being able to give your child the affection that they need. Okay, so that's authoritarian. Then the next one is opposite of that. It is high on the warmth, but very low on the discipline. So these parents are very complimentary and affectionate and lovey and huggy and almost to the point where they'll just give their child whatever they ask for, and they don't have a lot of structure and they don't have a lot of expectations. So these are the kids that are kind of spoiled. They get whatever they want. They run the show. They don't have a routine. They can go to bed whenever they want. They stay up all night. They eat whatever they want. And both of these two types, authoritarian and permissive, don't have great outcomes for the kids. As far as the research goes that has been done, pretty good, valid research over lots of years has shown that these two types are not as effective. They just don't have as good of results. The third type is the best type as far as what we see as outcomes for childhood, for child development. And that would be, they're high on both. It's a kind of a good medium in between the two. So they are affectionate and they have lots of conversations and they have that very warm relationship with their child. But they also have high expectations. So when you look at the word discipline, I don't want you to think that these kids are always getting punished, because that's not the case. That's more of the authoritarian. But they're high on, we have a structure, we have a routine, we have expectations, and they're high on the teaching aspect of making sure that their children are understanding right from wrong. So high on both of those scales is really the best outcomes for children that we've seen from these parenting styles. And then probably the worst outcomes is the neglectful. And that is really, they have neither. They have low on the affection and all of that, and then they're also low on the discipline. So these kids are just kind of ignored and left to do whatever. And that is a form of child abuse, this really neglectful type of parenting style. And the last thing I want to talk about is the difference between discipline and punishment. So I kind of alluded to it when I was talking about the different parenting styles. And I do have an announcement about this, but when you think about the word discipline, I want you to think about disciple or something like that, like more of an educational aspect, because really discipline is about teaching. And when a child does something wrong, we want to teach them, okay, why was that wrong? How could I do it better the next time? What should I do instead? And instead of just, you're grounded, with no explanation, that really doesn't teach them what to do better the next time. So this is just a lot of conversations, a lot of these teaching moments where you can, instead of just giving the kid a spanking and sending them to their room, you can have a conversation about why was that wrong and what should you do different next time and how does that make you feel and how does that make the other person feel, and just really having more of the teaching moments. That would be the difference between discipline and punishment. And we do talk about spanking in this unit. This is something that's a little bit controversial, and I'll get students say, well, you know, that's how my parents did it and I turned out fine, which I've heard that a lot. My point would be that there are more effective and better ways of disciplining than just using physical, whatever it happens to be. That the physical punishments don't have that long-term lasting effect like more of a discipline style would. And the main difference is just because of that teaching aspect. So when you're just giving a spanking, they're really not learning anything from that. And we've seen a lot of studies coming out recently about that spanking really has some harmful effects. And the kids that are spanked a lot continuously really don't have very good outcomes. And that's this sort of authoritarian idea. And you'll see a video on iLearn that really shows an extreme example of this. So when we're looking at spanking, I would just really recommend trying other methods first, because there are other methods that work a whole lot better and you can teach your child, and then it's better for them in the long run as far as learning how to act appropriately and remembering those lessons instead of just getting a short-term punishment that doesn't really change the behavior on the long term. So that is it for Unit 3. Let me know if you have any questions.